the narrator. It's later in life. And it seems to me, we were talking about this a little bit before, that it's the protagonist that's most obviously close to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely not autobiographical. It's filled with lies and things that didn't happen and stuff I made up. And the family isn't actually my family. But the kid is pretty much me-ish. I mean, if you know, there's a scene in the book about halfway through where our protagonist gets to escape down a drain pipe. You know, not the kind of drain pipes you have in America, but proper, heavy, cast iron drain pipes bolted to the side of a brick wall. The kind you can actually, you know, that you read about in stories. You climb up the drain pipe. So, and he goes down the drain pipe, and he goes down the drain pipe because he's learned to climb up and down the drain pipe because he's read in books that kids go up and down drain pipes, which is, you know, after I sent the book to my youngest sister to read, and she loved it, and she sent me an email back saying, I thought you'd like this. It's a photo of you, age 7, standing on that drain pipe. So that's me. Those are my knees, my sandals.
Is that toast in your pocket?
No toast. Toastless. But you know, that's the kind of thing where I actually cheated because my dad didn't actually find a baker's that would make giant, incredibly heavy brown bread things until I was about 12. I got the white sliced bread, and then when I was 12, actually there was a period where he would make his own bread, and that was terrible because he would make me sandwiches to take to school, and he'd make like cheese sandwiches or peanut butter sandwiches, and he never quite got the bread making thing down. So, although he always made them with enormous enthusiasm. So, they would crumble. They were incredibly crumbly. And by the time it got to lunchtime, it would somehow turn into a ball. And it would just be a ball with peanut butter or cheese at the center and crumbs. And you'd sort of pick this thing up and you'd go, you are not a sandwich. But anyway, so yes, there's an awful lot of me in there, and my point of view, and more than anything, the thing that I was trying to give to Amanda was there are places, a lot of the places that I grew up don't exist anymore. People build roads over them, build housing estates over them, they just sort of vanished. And I thought it would be fun to try and conjure up these places. So you could actually, you know, if you had access to Google Earth circa 1967, you could actually point to where all the things occur. But then, of course, I lie and I cheat and I move things around. And I took the pond from one place and moved it to another. I swapped farms around, but I cheat.
There's a really lovely line in there, which I can't do justice to, but where he's on the journey back, the geographic journey, and it's taking him back through time, and he sees that the lane is the only thing that hasn't changed. And you talk about, you know, this sort of living lane. It's really kind of lovely. Where was that at for you?
Well, that you know, I haven't actually gone back down that way, which is one of the things that's really interesting for me. Is the lane that we lived on. When I was a kid, I was completely convinced that the world that I lived in was a sort of, you know, essentially a sort of semi-mythological place. And, or at least I was able to always overlay it with a sort of peculiar mythology. So, when I heard that one of the farms down our lane was mentioned in the Doomsday Book, which was the big list of all the properties in England that was compiled for William the Conqueror, 1066, compiled probably about the 1080s. It didn't occur to me that, you know, 1,000 years before it would have been this little wooden hovel. I just went, that nice red brick farmhouse has been there for 1,000 years. And then I started thinking, well, wouldn't it be interesting if the people who had lived there who live there now had been the same people for 1,000 years. I don't think anyone would notice in this part of the world. And I started building this weird little personal mythology out of that. So somewhere in my teens, I decided they'd be called the Hempstocks. And I just had them, and they lived there, and they lived at the bottom of the lane. And I kept expecting to write a story about them. So, and seeing that I never actually got to write a story set in my lane, I never did. But I sort of decided that probably their family had spread out a little bit. So there are Hempstocks in Stardust, and then there's Liza Hempstock in the Graveyard Book. And I thought, okay, well, they're obviously relations. So one day, I had a vague idea I would go and write a story with the Hempstocks in it. And then, in about 2003, so that was sort of always sitting there. Then in about 2003, I bought my first Mini Cooper. And my father was visiting America at the time, he was still alive, and I said, you know, it's so fun having a Mini. It's peculiarly, I don't know whether by intention or by design, or just by accident, it's proportionally, they've made them bigger than they were when I was a kid. So it's proportionally exactly the same size than I was when I was a kid. It's like one of the few things that hasn't changed somehow, because it hasn't changed. I said, you know, I love that old white Mini that you have. Whatever happened, you know, why did you get rid of that? And he said, never told you that story, did I? And I said, no. And he said, well, we had a lodger, and he went gambling in Brighton, and he gambled away all his money, and he gambled away all his friends' money, and then he stole the Mini. And he said it was left down the lane, and I went down, identified the body, and sold the Mini that afternoon. And I didn't go, did he tell the person that he sold it to? I don't know. Let's call him. Sorry. I didn't ask that question, but mostly, and I also didn't, you know, that sort of weird thing where something is in the distant past. I didn't go, what a terrible tragedy. What I actually did was go, you mean something interesting happened in my house when I was 7? And nobody told me. There was this sort of 7-year-old outrage. Me going, there was all this interesting stuff in books, and I thought that never happened in real life, and something happened in real life, and I didn't know. And so I thought, one day, maybe I'll take that little weird kernel, and it's not about the real thing that happened, but I will take that kernel. And at the moment where I thought, well, actually, that's a story that does take place at the end of the lane. And I have the Hempstock family down there already, as they've been since I was 9, waiting for me. I'll see what happens. And that really is, I think, what propelled it into being.
That's interesting. Do you think the fact that when you started the project, you had every intention of it being a non-public story, that it gave you a little extra leeway to go to this very personal space? I mean, do you think that you would have told that story anyway?
Well, it's odd. I mean, the truth is, I've been doing the very personal stuff since the beginning. Yeah. Violent Cases, my first ever graphic novel. Mr. Punch, which I did in the mid-90s. There's a handful of short stories. There's one called Closing Time. There's a few of these short stories where I'll take a character who is pretty obviously me and write a very unreliable sequence of autobiography in which I change stuff around and start playing with it. You know, Violent Cases I wrote in 1986 as a very young man, and it's about being 3 years old and being treated by an osteopath who turns out to be Al Capone's osteopath, to have been. And slowly the Portsmouth of the 1960s and Chicago of the 1930s sort of collide in some peculiar ways. And that was one of the first things that I ever did. But normally what would happen whenever I would do these weird little personal stories is that they would be published to deafening silence. And the people would come up to me and say, I really like that thing, and I would say thank you, but they wouldn't actually touch nerves. They'd just be these weird things that I'd go, okay, I love the idea that, you know, by the end of my life, you'd have an entire, completely unreliable autobiography's worth of these things. But I don't think I would have done it had I known that I was writing a novel and that it was going to be published as a novel. I think that you know, it was absolutely a driving thing in this. It was going to be one of my little short stories, and it was essentially personal. I would have published it. It would have would have given it to an anthology or to a magazine or something once it was done, or possibly just kept it around for the next short story collection and gone, look, an unpublished short story. Like I did that, I think, with How to Talk to Girls at Parties in the last one.
Sure. So, and then,
which is another one of those incredibly unreliable autobiographies.
It's fiction. No one expects it to be reliable.
Oh, some of the questions that I get from people on the cards of these things are very, very puzzled. They actually want me to try, you know, they're like, could you tell us exactly what percentage is true? And tell us all the true bits. And I'm going the true bits. It doesn't work like that. It's like a giant, it's like a mosaic. You know, you have a mosaic picture, and it's a picture of some people, and if you get close, it's all made up of tiny little squares, and there's red squares, and there's hue squares, and there's green squares, and there's black squares, and there's red squares, and you know, so all the little red squares are true, but they're not the picture. They're sitting there in sentences next to lies, next to fiction, and they're just little things that make it feel, you know, they're there to add a level of veracity to an otherwise completely unreliable narrative.
The bricks and the mortar.
They are. Basically, they're there to convince you that I'm not lying to you.
Yeah. I totally believe it, everything you said. Do you find that the writing craft, for you, what do you find is the challenge that you have at this stage in your career? Every stage of your career, you have a different challenge, a different opportunity. What do you see as your challenges?
I think the biggest challenge right now, which is definitely a completely different challenge to when I started out, is trying to do stuff I haven't done before. And that's always something that keeps you going. But when you're starting out, everything you do is new. I found it a lot right now working on the new Sandman stuff that I'm making. When I began writing Sandman in 1987, dear God, everything was new. Every panel was new. I'd never done that panel transition before. I'd never written that thing, and it was all completely new, and I didn't know how to do it. So that was the challenge. The challenge was, I have no idea what I'm doing. But every time I make the reader turn a page, I've just done a whole bunch of panels that I've never done before. Now, I'll go, okay, I'll do this. Oh no, that was in that issue. Okay, so I'll do, oh no, I did that one. They won't, no, I did that in Brief Lives. And there's this sort of weird feeling of just desperately trying to go, I've actually done an awful lot of things. I've written a lot, I've said a lot. And so the challenge for me is always trying to go, okay, well, how do I either do it new and make it different and make it interesting? Or a new and odder challenge for me is sometimes how do I revisit things and keep it fresh? So with Sandman right now, it's a weird kind of how do I revisit it and keep it fresh. I just did a short story called How the Marquis Got His Coat Back, which is the first piece of it's the first piece of neverwhere fiction I've ever done since the novel. And it basically came into existence because the BBC did this absolutely fantastic audio, which will come out, by the way, for sale in September. There to sort of negotiate. And it had these fantastic people. It had James McAvoy, it had Benedict Cumberbatch, it had Christopher Lee. You are so clappy.
They just want Cumberbatch to be Sandman.
I bet that everybody who clapped Benedict Cumberbatch is also wearing a Doctor Who t-shirt. My theory. I have seen more unlicensed Doctor Who t-shirts on this tour than BBC Worldwide knows exist. I have now seen 6 licensed t-shirts, as opposed to about 7,000. And I loved the adaptation they did. It was fantastic, and it was really fun. I thought, well, I really like Neverwhere. I should go and finish that story.
Yeah.
And I had half a page, literally, of a short story that I'd started in 2002, and it never got finished or even continued. It never got past the first page because I started it on the wrong kind of paper, which sounds kind of prissy. I know, if you're an author, it's not the wrong kind. So a fan, you lot are marvelous, and you give me things. And I, for my part, try and use the things that I'm given. And a fan gave me a beautiful sort of leather-bound notebook with absolutely beautiful paper in, and said, here, take this. I made the paper myself, I made the notebook myself, and the paper actually has crushed rose petals in the paper. And I went, how great.
It's a lot of pressure.
Well, what the person giving it to me hadn't thought through, and what I didn't know until he started writing, is if you take a fountain pen and try and write on paper that has crushed rose petals in it, every line you will hit a crushed rose petal bit, and it will clog your pen. And after about, a page of cleaning the pen every line, I went, and I put the notebook aside, but I felt so guilty about the fact that the short story was sitting there. I went and got a completely different notebook and wrote a completely different story, which was one called Monarch of the Glen, which showed up in Smoke and Mirrors and other places. So I had the words, how the Marquis got his coat back underlined, and a description that lasted about half a page of his coat. And nothing actually in the way of plot. And so I had to go, okay, how do I do a Neverwhere story? I haven't done Neverwhere since 1996. This is going to be exciting and weird, and it was really fun. But it was fun, but again, I had to figure out how you go back. So that's the challenge for me right now, is just not wanting to repeat myself, not wanting to ever, in the words of Douglas Adams, become my own word processor.
I don't know if she's cheering.
Whatever she was cheering, I'm for it.
Do you have other, I think if I remember correctly, it's either Tom Clancy or Joseph Wambaugh, there's one or the other, that only writes with a Ticonderoga #2 pencil.
Roll down.
Yeah, well, there's 2 people.
No, I do have my weird little sorts of quirks. I tend to write in fountain pen. I started doing that with Stardust, and liked it so much. I just liked what it did to the prose. I liked the fact that it felt like it tightened everything. When I start on computer and I work into it, I notice I never delete anything. I just get bigger. And my prose has a tendency to bloat. Whereas and I always feel bad about, I can't write a page and then just delete it. Whereas if I'm writing in a notebook and then I have to type stuff out, I can look at a page and go, you're rubbish. And I can not type it out, and I feel like I've saved myself work. Rather than that I've thrown something away or something. So, but what I do like to do in a notebook is change the ink color every day. Have a couple of pens on the go in different ink colors so that I can actually look and see how productive I was that day. And I actually like that. I can go, look, half a page in green, and then it goes blacky, didn't do anything that day. Or I can go, look, 8, 9 pages here in brown ink.
A sea of brown.
Look, I did it. So that I like. That's definitely in terms of weird writing rituals.
Is there any time that how much do you hold back your ideas before you say them to anybody? As far as, is there a vulnerable stage or a protean stage where you think you've learned that you don't share at that point, or do you just?
I used to share compulsively and with joy and enthusiasm, and people say, "What are you working on? What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to do this." I would tell them book ideas, I would tell them story ideas, and that started fading after a panel at World Fantasy Con at Chicago in 1989, I think, where Terry Pratchett and I announced the title of what would have been the sequel to Good Omens. And the following year, one of the people on the panel brought out a book with that title. And we went, "Oh, that's interesting. You can do that, I suppose." Yes, you can do that. And sort of learned a little bit from that. And also, there was a time when I watched my former English agent kill an entire project for me. When she said, "What are you working on now? What are you thinking about?" And I said, "Well, I've got this thing that I'm thinking about." And I told her this entire plot. And it was just this weird, goofy little thing that I was thinking of. I don't even know if I'd figured out whether it was going to be a comic or a book or whatever, but it was about this kid who decides that the only way, he makes a promise to he's not terribly smart, he makes a promise to his mother that he will make a name for himself in the world, people will know his name, and then he realizes that he has absolutely no talents or skills of any kind. And he thinks, well, actually, you don't have to be skilled and talented, you can just murder somebody. So he decides that he will go down to Disneyland, he will be the person who shot Mickey Mouse. And after that, things got very weird. But I had this whole plot, and I'm sort of telling her about it, and I get to the end, and it's all been sort of fun and weird and exciting, and you have all these sort of, Disney enforcers in goofy masks and things coming around. I may have filed off some of the serial numbers. It might have been called The Mouse, and it's probably was. Probably was. And I got to the end, and I finished, and there was a long pause, and she said, "Not very high concept, is it, dear?" And I've never written it. That was that. That one was buried. It just went, oh, and died. So,
that's awful.
So that was sort of the point where I started being a little bit more holding things in. And I also the internet changed things a bit. When I was starting out, I'd be on a signing tour for Sandman. I'd go out and sign some copies of Sandman, and people would say, "So, who's the missing brother that we haven't met yet?" And I'd say, "Oh, it's Distraction." They'd say, "Oh, cool." And so, that kind of thing. Yeah. And what are you going to do with this? And I just tell them, because it's fine, you're in a comic shop. And then, somewhere in the early 90s, the Rec Arts comics started appearing, and these, and suddenly I discovered, oh, hang on, if I tell somebody something in a comic shop somewhere, I'm no longer just telling one guy in a comic shop somewhere. I'm now actually technically telling the world. Yeah, and I had to start learning to keep secrets about things that I was planning to do in fiction.
Yeah. That's good. I think we have a special delivery.